Good evening, everyone. My name is Leah Thill. I'm with the Michiana Area Council of Governments. I'm the Senior Environmental Planner, and this evening we are pleased to provide a virtual input session for reimagining the former CG Conn site in Elkhart, which used to be a musical instrument manufacturing site. And we were really pleased with our turnout last week. We had over 40 people that joined us in person at the High Dive Pavilion, and we got just a lot of really specific feedback, and we were able to understand the concerns of nearby residents and some preferences for what people would like to see with the reuse. So today we are extending this opportunity virtually for you all to give input, and then we'll be following up with a survey in the future so that the general public and other community stakeholders can submit their own comments in writing. First, we want to introduce our Regional Brownfields Coalition grant team. As I mentioned, I'm with MACOG, and I'm going to give Metric Environmental and their team a chance to introduce themselves to you all.
I'm Pat Likens. I'm with Metric Environmental. I'm the Senior Project Manager. So we manage the completion, the accomplishment of the environmental investigations and provide consultation and advice to try to see this project from the beginning to the end. And Conn is a very exciting piece of that project. So, Yolanda?
Hi, my name is Yolanda Boucher. I'm president of Revitalized Communities. I am also part of the Metric Environmental team. Revitalized Communities is a community development company, and we help specifically with community outreach and also reuse, working with reuse options and planning. I've been with, my company has been around since 2018. Before then, I worked for the EPA, where I was head of Brownfields redevelopment for Region 5. I'm happy to be here. I've spent quite a bit of time in Elkhart with Superfund sites in my past and with Brownfield sites. So I'm happy to work with you on this one.
Great, thank you, Yolanda. Let's have someone from Roberts Environmental. Dave, would you like to go next?
Yeah, hi, I'm Dave Jeffers with Roberts Environmental, and we're here local out of Goshen, Indiana. And we've collected soil and groundwater samples at the site and helped out with a lot of the field work. We've been on some of the larger sites that I'm sure locally here everyone's heard of, and we have considerable experience in this area. So that's kind of how we're helping out the team.
I want to give you some background on the Regional Brownfields Coalition and the US EPA grant that's enabling this work that we're doing today. So MACOG has received a $600,000 grant and formed a coalition of the 4 counties in our region in order to benefit the broader regional area. Our target areas, as we're talking about today, has included the general downtown area around Elkhart. We've also focused on the Argonne Corridor in Warsaw, parts of downtown Plymouth in Marshall County, as well as sites in small towns across the region and a few sites in South Bend. As I mentioned with the grant, that runs until next year, and then we're in the process of applying for more funding because the need for getting more environmental data and doing reuse and cleanup planning on these sites outstrips the resources that we have. So we're pursuing additional rounds of funding. This picture here shows one of the sites that we have been looking at, and we're not really talking about this site today. We can have a future meeting where we really dive in deep on 1701 Sterling, but this is another really high priority site from the City of Elkhart's perspective. So a little bit of a grant overview, starting with the definition of a brownfield. There's no specific list of brownfields, and sometimes I get people asking about, is this on the brownfields list that the state has, or what does that mean? Really, a brownfield can be any property that there's a perception or a stigma that it might be contaminated, and there's a risk associated with that, so it doesn't get developed. People don't buy that property because they're afraid of walking into more liability or contamination, health risks, things that maybe they're not equipped to deal with. So a brownfield is not just those that the state's already aware of or MACOG's already aware of. It's really any property that redevelopment's been complicated by a past history related to industrial or commercial use. And it doesn't always mean that there's actual contamination there, but just the perception is what leads it to not be developed and put back to a more productive proactive use. So our grant is focusing on doing environmental sampling of soil and groundwater, but also in getting an inventory of priority sites and understanding what sites are top of the list to handle with the limited resources that we have, doing planning, so cleanup plans, reuse visions, like we're starting that process today, and then some community outreach. Just want to be clear that we don't have funding for cleanup. That cleanup funding comes from separate state sources or separate awards from the Environmental Protection Agency. So we do not have any cleanup funding associated with our grant. Those are all separate as listed here on the slide. So now I want to transition to Yolanda to give an overview of how to think about the planning process and how what we're doing today fits into that. So Yolanda.
Thank you, Leah. Well, right now we are doing part of our community involvement process. We're trying to get ideas and a sense of what the community members and other community stakeholders think about the process, the property itself, their hopes for the future. And it's a sort of a three-pronged process that comes from three different areas. First of all is what we're doing right now. Actually, everything under that community involvement process list we're doing. We are educating ourselves about community plans and ideas for the area. We're going to talk about the current status of the building and the site as far as contamination and ideas for redevelopment. And we're also going to talk about developer interest in the site, where we are at this point. What I'd like to work with you on during this meeting, and we did last week, is to hear about your hopes and dreams for the sites. What do you think the community is lacking that it needs? And is this the appropriate place to try to fill in gaps? We also have to prioritize those hopes and dreams as far as the appropriateness for the site, as well as the ability to offer them. And we're going to look at the market's needs and abilities. Market studies are done. They have been done for this area, and they tell us what the city sees is needed based on the market studies. We want to look at that and give that a high consideration, but also if you don't agree with those are the needs for the site, let us know now while we're still open to changing and looking at different ideas. Once we get all that, we have to weigh the considerations, and the considerations are financials, structural, and logistical. How much does this cleanup? First of all, we're just dealing with the assessment right now. The cleanup and then the redevelopment is going to cost, and what will it return to the city and the community? Logistical, how do we go about cleaning it up? How do we go about building it so it's appropriate for the site? Also, the whole process of getting the right developer and getting the right type of reuse in the end. And structural considerations. Is there anything on the building worth saving? Is there anything that we're going to not be able to build on a type of land that we have there? All of those things have to be looked at before we can really make a good reuse determination. Next slide. So what we're also going through is deciding about cleanup and reuse planning. And there's a lot of planning that goes into this, whether or not the end product goes perfect with the planning is yet to be seen, but the closer it is, the more successful this process has been. So there's a site plan that will be developed, and it comes from three different areas. It comes from community plans, what we've already have looked at for this site, what the city has already done studies on, and what you've already discussed in the past for the whole community area. Reuse objectives. What do we want after we look at our hopes and dreams and look at what the studies show and look at what's feasible? What do we think is the best thing to do? And and also known site conditions. And that's what's going on now, trying to figure out what's there, what's in the ground, where the contaminants are, and what we should do to clean up. So we'll have cleanup plans. We'll determine from those construction considerations, first of all, how do you remove soil? How do you work with the soil that's there? And then how do you build on it the way the site is once it's cleaned up? As well as what we discussed, the desired future use. Will it be a public site? Will it be commercial or industrial? Will it be residential? Do you want parks and trails, or do you want a mixed use? We have, I believe, 10 acres there. So it can possibly be a mixture of uses as long as they fit well together.
So just want to provide a little bit of regional context here to this conversation. MACOG, in partnership with a lot of economic development partners, as well as local governments and other stakeholders in the region, helps us to develop our regional comprehensive economic development strategy. And some of the smart growth principles within that are relevant to brownfields development and how we think about that revitalization process, and really focusing on enhancing quality of place, attracting talent. Both of those are goals that have really risen to the top over the last few years, as well as increasing density, walkability, and alternative transportation, and addressing housing shortages and creating affordable and safe housing. The city had a study of the residential market potential performed a few years ago and identified gaps in the housing shortage. So multifamily for rent was the biggest need, single family detached was second, and then third was detached, and then single family attached. So we think of duplexes and townhomes. Those were the top gaps in availability. And then that was followed up in 2019 by the development of the Elkhart housing strategy to address that shortage. And some of the priorities were to increase density and infill development, which is relevant to this conversation, given the proximity to downtown, and repurposing blighted sites and reducing blight in the community. There were many other items associated with the housing strategy, but those are most relevant to our conversation today. And then pre-pandemic and then continuing into the current administration, they've been focusing on the Elkhart 2040 plan and long-range planning for the city, looking at affordability, workforce housing, and providing diverse housing options, as well as many other items not as directly related to today's conversation. This site is within the downtown TIF, and that means there's some potential limited funding available for infrastructure improvements, though it competes against other priorities elsewhere in downtown for that funding. So just keep that in mind. And if you'd like to look at this information, the links are available on the slides there to look at those documents. So that's the local context, the planning that's been done, the housing shortage that's been identified. And then of course, the redevelopment commission has taken site control and owns the property now. That was a question that came up early on in the in-person meeting. So it's no longer tax delinquent, is no longer owned by a third party. The city has control over its destiny. So that was a major step forward. So keep that in mind as we're talking, that that's not a barrier to be able to gain control of the property. All right, so now we're going to switch over to sharing some of the environmental data and explain some of the work that's been done over the last year approximately. And this was funded by the grant. So we've spent about $70,000 of that just on this site alone, because it's been such a big priority, given its prominence, proximity to downtown, reuse and redevelopment potential, and just the history of the site as the former manufacturing facility for CG Conn for musical instruments. So just want to make sure we're all talking about the same site, because there are other sites on Beardsley, and just want to get us all on the same page. So this is the aerial view by the health campus next door, the school, St. Joseph River, and the condos. This is Beardsley and Greenleaf Boulevard. This is what it looks like from that intersection, looking to the southeast. This is what it looks like looking to the southwest at the existing entrance to the health campus here, and the existing building, which so everyone's on the same page. I don't think anyone's arguing to save that building at this point. Demolition seems to be the consensus that would be the best way forward for that structure. So now over to Dave.
Thanks, Leah. Yeah, a little bit of history. the city was actually looking to obtain this property several years ago. So it kind of started with what's called a phase 1 environmental site assessment back in 2016. And as part of that, we found out a lot of the history, and it's been a manufacturing property, well, till the early 1900s through the 1980s, when they finally demolished most of the buildings except the one we see today. And so you see where the green dot is, and then the far west is a parking lot. So all of that grassy area, basically the eastern 2/3 of the property, that was all covered with the CG Conn manufacturing facility. So we discovered basically, like a lot of manufacturing facilities back in the day, they basically did everything to make their instruments. They had a foundry there. They plated their instruments. They actually made the cases for the instruments. They had machine shops. So, I mean, a little bit of everything. And then what we also found out is there was some environmental work, very limited, done in the 1990s and early 2000s that really did, it kind of indicated there may be a problem with chlorinated solvents in the soil and groundwater. So knowing that, the city kind of put this, I'd say, pretty close to top priority on their list when MACOG and Leah came to them, as far as potentially paying for some sampling. So yeah, we did basically an initial site investigation, or a phase 2 environmental site assessment, and then also followed that up with a further site investigation. So all in all, we've collected 32 soil samples and 21 total groundwater samples. And that included deep and a little shallower soil samples at different locations. And then also most of those groundwater samples were collected from the water table, which is about 10 feet down here is all. But we did collect some deeper groundwater samples. The deeper groundwater samples were all clean. We didn't have any detection. So all of the quote unquote groundwater contamination will be seen in the next slide is all shallow right at the water table. So, yep, there you go. And then, so just kind of to decipher this slide here, all the yellow dots are sample locations where we did soil sampling and or groundwater sampling, and the blue dots with crosses in the middle of them, those are actually permanent monitoring wells that we have installed. So if you walk out there today, you'll actually see those wells. They look like little tiny manholes in the ground. So the blue, what I was talking about, the blue outline there that kind of starts in the middle of the eastern portion and goes directly west, that is TCE, which is trichloroethylene contamination in the shallow groundwater. And then I call it kind of burnt orange outlines. There's a bigger one there, and then a smaller one up by the building. That is TCE contamination in soil. And then the gray areas, which are kind of, yep, there it's analogous to the TCE. And then the other one on the other side, that's metals impacts. And when I say metals, it's primarily lead. There is a little bit of silver there. So obviously they did some silver plating on some of their instruments. So this is really kind of the nuts and bolts of where we start to even think about planning, because you have to know where the contamination is. And really there's 3 different levels, I guess, if you will. It's probably not the best way to put it, but you know, we kind of knew there was going to be contamination. We didn't know how bad, but you know, sometimes it's about what you think it's going to be. Sometimes it's a lot worse, that you find things that's, you know, way worse than you thought it was going to be. And I would kind of characterize this site as kind of either about what we thought, or maybe even a little less contamination than we thought there was going to be. And the reason I say that is the TCE in groundwater, if you just take that blue out, there's actually very little impacted soil that we've discovered, and the levels aren't that high. We don't have any levels that are over commercial industrial direct contact screening levels, so that's a good thing. There's 2 spots of lead that are over, I'm sorry, but you can see the gray areas are much, much smaller than the burnt orange areas. So these are things we can all, what Yolanda alluded to with some nice planning and an actual, once we know what type of structures are going there or where the utility is going to go, we can actually plan around that. And then if you add the blue back in, so right about where it says site in red, that's right about our highest area. And the concentrations there are 12 micrograms per liter, which the cleanup level is 5 micrograms per liter. So we're really not even that far off of, being quote unquote a clean site. So as you go to the west, kind of follow that blue arrow toward the corner of Greenleaf and Beardsley, it basically goes down to single digits. It's almost all 7, 6, 5 point something in those areas. So we're in pretty low concentrations in the groundwater by the time we reach the intersection of Greenleaf and Beardsley. So, I do want to point out the pink dots up there to the north. That is also that's a state brownfield site, the Burgerson Screw site, that they have been monitoring with the help of the city as well. But they actually recently did some remediation there. They injected some substances, and their most recent groundwater monitoring actually came back very favorable, and they were successful with that. So I just wanted to point that out, that there's another, brownfield property in the neighborhood.
I do want to point out the city also owns the Bergerson Screw site. And as Dave was mentioning, the last report, we'll see if, levels could always bounce back, but they were dipping from above screening levels to below after that latest treatment. And, residents who live in this area, they aren't just concerned about what's coming off this site, but also holistically, what other impacts are there. And so that was encouraging news on this site. And a lot of that will depend on additional sampling that will need to be done, kind of refining where the building foundation is going to go. Do we need to do some more sampling in those areas to see what needs to be done? And then also follow up with cleanup planning. And so send the data to IDEM and get their input on what's safe and what's appropriate. So it may be some institutional controls restricting the use of groundwater or something. That's just for an example that that's a restriction IDEM could impose. They could impose a restriction against any residential use. Dave, do you want to say anything else about potential, like removing some soil in limited areas?
Yeah. And like Leah said, it's all about risk. So, by obviously everybody's on city water out there. So we could easily put a restriction on using the groundwater at that particular property. So that would obviously take care of the ingestion risk of the groundwater. And then, so if you kind of just visually take away the blue shading and just kind of concentrate on the burnt orange and gray areas, once we know a plan exactly, for an example, if that whole kind of southeastern portion is going to be parking lot, well, we may not have to do anything with that because it's going to be covered. And the only restriction is, well, you have to maintain that cover. So the levels aren't off the charts, but the little gray areas, there's actually 2. So if something goes there, like a foundation or a sewer utility trench or water utility that would have to go right through that area, then yes, we would probably have to dig it out and take it off site for disposal. But really, it's not that bad. And as far as the planning portion of it, just some good planning will take care of, not having to do a lot of remediation. It certainly appears that way.
Mm-hmm. And we got some feedback in our in-person meeting that people would like to see more sampling on the far edge of the site, just to feel more comfortable that we understand the levels. The reason the sampling stopped for now is that we got below screening levels. But when we have future funding, we'll look at adding a few sampling points for peace of mind down there. And then other sampling will be needed when the building's removed, just investigating these areas. But just to be efficient, we need to get a better idea of the reuse vision of the community before we can do more defined sampling in specific areas and have a site plan and all that.
Well,
go
as
ahead.
an example, if everybody wants this to be a park, well, there might not be hardly any remediation. You might just have to clean up a couple spots and, rather than if everybody wants single family homes, well, there could be a little bit more remediation and sampling.
Yep. I do also want to mention one of the next steps is right now we're moving towards doing some sampling offsite. Dave, do you want to summarize that? Where this
Ish.
dotted line is?
Sure. Yeah, kind of right where that yellow dot is. So on either side, there's the two residential homes there. So the state would like us, even though we're not over what's considered the screening level for vapors, just to double make sure, the state wants us to do some soil gas vapor sampling. And we are doing that, as in the process of getting approved for that as well. So we'll do two soil gas samples. And again, it's just a screening to double make sure that vapors are not going to be a problem. And then also, I believe that's Dearborn Street there going up to the northwest. So along that street and in the alley back there behind the homes, we'll be collecting 6 additional groundwater samples. So hopefully, and what we want to know there is, hey, how long do these single digits go for, these 6s and 7s and 5s, or does it stop abruptly and basically only goes across the street and it's done? So we're basically trying to get the westerly definition on that blue area, and then also double check to make sure vapors aren't a problem.
Yep. Other questions about environmental? All right. I want to give, Dana is on the call with us now. I want to give her a chance to just provide some comments from the mayor's administration and about this site.
Hi, everybody. Good evening. Thanks, MACOG, for allowing me to speak tonight. Primarily what I was asked to share with the group is just some information about our approach around housing and development. I don't think it's a secret to anyone that there are extreme housing shortages in the city of Elkhart and throughout Elkhart County. And so we have a variety of initiatives going on to help facilitate the development of housing along many price points, but especially in the area of workforce housing. While clearly we're way too early on in the process to say what the use will be for this site, we are looking at a variety of sites to help to encourage housing developments, and there's a possibility that this one could be one of those sites. There has been some interest around 1101 Beardsley, and so I think you'll have an opportunity to kind of comment on some of the concepts for this area. But I look forward to hearing your feedback as we consider best possible uses.
Great, thank you, Dana. And just a little context, I didn't give you a full introduction, but Dana's the Director of Development Services with the city and also former Chief of Staff for the mayor. So she's very involved at a high level with the mayor's priorities. We got a question about the building, if it will be cleared of equipment, tools, and materials, or is it cleared of equipment, tools, and materials? Dave, why don't you handle that? Did you go inside or was it unsafe to do so?
We did in 2016, and last year the police cleared it for us, and we did walk in certain areas, but there's really no real equipment in the building. Some of the ceilings have fallen down, and as you might expect, there's trash and things like that in different spots. But as far as equipment, there's not, Conn didn't leave a lot of stuff there. Excuse me. Coachman RV actually used the building for its offices for a while back in the 90s and 2000s. So they kind of cleared out most of everything that Conn left, basically.
Yep. We got a couple more questions about whether there will be restrictions in the deeds. And I think we covered that, that remains to be seen with IDEM. And then will the site be broken into smaller parcels? I think that piece depends on if it will be a giant green space or single family homes. I would think it will be divided based on what is approved and what's requested to make the reuse happen that that comes out of this process. So okay, so now we're going to go into a little bit of a brainstorming session, which Yolanda will facilitate, and I will stop sharing the screen.
Now we're going to get move to the next area, which involves brainstorming. And this is, remember when I talked on the chart earlier, we talked about hopes and dreams. And I want to talk about that now. So we've seen the site, we've seen some of the contamination that could be on the site. I want to discuss what you all, and if you know, because this part is not going to go online, if you all could let us see your lovely faces, it would be great. But I would like to see what kind of ideas you have for the site. Do you think it should be housing? Do you think it should be some sort of retail, maybe a grocery store or something else? Is there enough schools in the area? What are some of your thoughts on the reuse?
And said his preference would be single family housing with a strong emphasis on green development, meaning a large canopy of older trees, flower beds and landscaping, maybe some water features, so that it was a natural development. That would be, so single family homes was what he shared.
You know, there's a lot of ideas. The city has expressed a need for housing. So, you know, Dwight was on plan with the thought of single family housing and green space. It's enough room there for both. There's also ideas of mixed use on the property where you might have some retail, some single family homes. There are a lot of things to consider when you talk about that, or some multi-unit residentials. A lot of ideas when you talk about that is traffic patterns and other issues. But let's look at the reuse concepts that the city has.
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect.
I'm curious, Dana, if you wanted to give an overview of how the city got to this point with a few reuse concepts. Otherwise, I can cover the background on the Redevelopment Commission and that process earlier this year.
Maybe just a little bit. But at this point, the redevelopment, the RDC owns the property on behalf of the city, and have been doing, trying to figure out what is the best and highest use of this property. There is no desire to allow it to continue to languish, but the first step, of course, was to understand what the environmental impact is at the space. But in the meantime, it has been offered up for private development. And we have received so far 2 different concepts for use for this space. And so what I believe Leah is about to show you are 2 kind of high-level concepts that have been offered up to the Redevelopment Commission for their consideration. And one of the things I would like to get out of this discussion is the thoughts of members of the community about the concepts that they are looking, that they'll see in a moment.
Great. Yeah, and a little bit more on process. So I believe it was February, but there was an appraisal of the value of this property, and then the Redevelopment Commission formally asked for proposals from developers. And in that process, no proposals were received at that time. And once that deadline ended, and then the city could more informally receive other proposals, and a few have since come in. So we're not at a point, I don't think the city's at the point of saying like, these are our only 2 options and we're going to pick one. I think it's just more at a high level brainstorming, you know, what do members of the community like about different elements, and going from there. So it could be that one of these developers moves forward, but I think at this point we're just gathering feedback for the administration on, and it helps to have something to start with to get an idea of what might be possible, even if it's that you don't like it. So, and then after I show the redevelopment concepts, allow you some time to react, and then I'll also share just a really brief summary of what feedback we heard in the in-person session. This concept is a mixture of residential and commercial. So a little bit on the western side, kind of separate, retail, 1-story, and then a little bit of green area, pavilion, some seating, and then the remainder of the property residential use, more in the medium density to apartment buildings, but the apartment buildings are only 4 stories. And then the townhomes are 2 stories abutting East Beardsley. You can see the number of units, 8 each on the townhomes and 60 per the 2 apartment buildings that are tucked away in the back. But then the green buffer, the existing trees remain between Greenleaf Boulevard and the proposed redevelopment in this example. It also does not propose any additional access points for vehicles onto Greenleaf. And it adds 2 access points onto East Beardsley to the north. So that's just kind of a rough idea. No driveways are going, these are, I believe, just sidewalk connections from the townhomes. So no driveways are directly connected to the street there. That gives you a fairly good idea of the overall concept. Just for some more visuals that were provided by the developer, this shows the entrance to the neighborhood. You can get a feel for that. And then this is from Beardsley, which is how most people would interact with the site. Where you saw that old manufacturing building, it would look more like this with the townhomes. And this is a view down the pedestrian path. And then this is a look at the apartment buildings, the 4 stories, of what that might look like there, the vision for that. Yeah, so that's one concept of kind of a medium density housing with some separate retail where the parking area is now. This is a different concept, and this is not fully fleshed out, but this is intended to be just a mix of different housing types, but this time including single family and some duplexes and some apartments and some potential commercial as well. Just as an example, row homes, stacked apartments above retail, larger single family homes and smaller single family homes, and then potentially some granny flats. And so where you see these blank parcels, from what I understand from the developer, that could be, that would be up to the community. What would you want to see, more single family or duplexes? So wherever it's blank, that's just not, there's not a specific proposal for those parcels at this point. Want to note that it does have Rose Street going all the way through. It adds vehicle access in 3 points onto Greenleaf. And these are not driveways, or they're not intended to be driveways there, I don't think. Maybe they are.
No, those are not driveways.
Okay.
Greenleaf.
Okay, thank you. That's important and helpful. So they would maybe access, yeah, it looks like they would access their homes from the alley in the back, which is important if people are going to be backing out or not, important to know. So that gives a summary of that concept. And then the same developer is also interested potentially in a development that would be, instead of that mixture of housing types, more of a single family idea. And this is a photo, an overhead view of the Triangle neighborhood development right next to Notre Dame. It's mixed income. It's about the same size. So it gives you an idea. This is maybe more dense than what we've heard from folks would be preferred in this area, but it's close to Notre Dame. So there is some element of townhomes on part of that. But this is another concept for what residential and single family homes could look like. And so you might prefer more green space than what's here, a different mix or balance. But those are just a few different concepts to get you thinking about specifics of what you would want to see here. So yeah, go ahead.
The opportunity, if there are other people who had thoughts that they weren't able to express about either about the drawings or about the space itself and usage. There have been concerns about traffic. I don't know if that's as prevalent as it seemed to be in the first meeting. And density. Or you might want something totally different than housing.
We had really strong interest in a park and green space, so that was interesting. Some folks saying that they wanted all green space, all park. For those who wanted residential, they wanted to see a low density single family. Some people did not like the idea of commercial. Others thought that maybe more professional offices like architecture, accounting, attorneys would be appropriate, but those concerns seem to stem first and foremost from what Yolanda was saying, traffic congestion at certain times of the day, or some people said, or all the time, other people said, and safety and speeding, and just adding more points of conflict and entrances onto Greenleaf. That was a big concern. A lot of people did not want to see any more traffic coming onto Greenleaf along the curve. That was some pretty strong sentiment we got. People said no grocery store because Kroger's is nearby. Someone said maybe a library. Someone said a petting zoo. We got just a lot of comments about parks. I would say that was the biggest sentiment. But people felt that until traffic was addressed, that influences what they say about what they actually want. So maybe they would be fine with townhomes and apartments, but how many extra vehicles does that add? That was just kind of a primary concern. So
Traffic studies would be in.
Yeah, and we do have traffic count data. So we've got 8,000 vehicles per day on East Beardsley and just under 2,000 on Greenleaf. So in total, it's not that much, but it's possible that they're really concentrated in the morning and in the afternoon for short periods of time that people are experiencing that congestion. So the feedback survey will ask for specific preferences on interventions, or what would you or wouldn't you want to see as changes to traffic pattern or traffic flow, just to capture that feedback. And then we also asked about price points and what people wanted to see. And we got some feedback online saying housing for seniors, affordable housing, workforce housing, veteran housing, and maybe even permanent supportive housing. We got feedback in the meeting that was more preferring to see homes selling for over $200,000 and no age-based housing. So wanting to see a mix of ages. And then online, people were saying, well, there's the Greenleaf Health Campus, which I think has a nursing home. And so it could be a nice transition for 55 plus into that facility, and just differences, opinions, a variety of different thoughts and comments that we got. But since you all were not at the in-person, wanted to make sure you had an opportunity to hear what those who showed up had to say. So I think that about covers most of the comments that we received.
And there's also, the plans that you saw, for instance, the townhouses, they had a design on here. It doesn't mean that that's how it has to look. And I know there was some comments that they might want a different style, different look to the townhouses. So those kinds of things, whatever your thoughts are on it, we're happy to listen.
Yeah. So you can feel free to interrupt here before we start next steps, or raise your hand. Just know that you'll get the chance to provide anonymous feedback in that survey after this meeting. So after you have some time to digest everything. Great. So I want to give Dana a chance also, if Dana wants to say anything about next steps from your perspective with the administration.
The only thing that I will add is that clearly, we're waiting to hear back some of the information around the environmentals. I know there's still some work that you are looking to get done in that space. I think that'll help inform some of the best use opportunities. And And also, I appreciate being able to hear some of the feedback from the citizens. So as we consider proposals, that the redevelopment commission will be able to use all of that information that's been gathered in helping them to make their decision. As we mentioned, we have a couple of proposals before us right now, and assuming that if the decision is to use this space for private use, the redevelopment commission will we're creating a standard vetting process for proposals for private development. So they will use that process to vet projects, and it considers everything from, is it in line with the comprehensive land use? It considers if it's in line with the aesthetic of the neighborhood. It considers things like traffic that we've mentioned earlier, all of our zoning and code laws that are on the books are part of the vetting process. And of course, community engagement is part of what is used to vet projects. So there are a lot of steps left before a decision will be made. And this is just early on in the process.
Yeah, and I think, and correct me if this is not the accurate understanding here, are you still accepting additional proposals from other developers at this point?
Yes, because it's outside of the RFP process now, it is still possible for proposals to come forward.
Yep. So these are not necessarily the only ones the city would
Yeah.
consider. So just wanted to be clear about that. So just to go through these next steps here, that first line obviously shouldn't be there because we are at the virtual input session. We do not have any more planned at this time. We're going to be providing that written survey instead, to have more broad input from those who weren't able to make it on a 5:30 timeframe. So this fall, we'll be proceeding with that offsite sampling to identify, delineate the extent of the solvents in groundwater extending offsite to the northwest. And then we'll also be compiling and sharing all the feedback from the survey and from these meetings with the city administration to help refine a reuse vision, and looking at the viability of some of the ideas that were brought forward. And then next year, we'll be working on cleanup planning. And once we get to the point of having a reuse vision defined by the city and a developer on board, and we have a site plan, then we'll be able to do possibly some more sampling as needed for the planned reuse, as Dwight had been mentioning his concern about making sure the reuse is safe. So some additional sampling would come in at that point, cleanup planning, and then what cleanup would take place to allow the reuse to move forward safely in partnership with the Indiana Department of Environmental Management and their feedback. And then in that timeframe, somewhere the city would be negotiating with potential developers and getting to a development agreement, and at some time transferring the property to a developer if the city decided to go with a private use rather than a public use for this site. So that's what the next year or so will look like. These things don't happen overnight, but this site has been sitting here for decades. So hopefully we have some momentum moving forward. The number, from what I could tell, and the overwhelming consensus of those in the room, was that anything that brought vehicles to the area was not wanted. And so even with the park, they said, make the parking lot as small as possible. And so traffic congestion and safety and speeding was really driving how people were viewing the reuses they wanted. It wasn't, what does it look like? Or is this an appropriate place for housing? It was more, housing brings cars. And a park maybe wouldn't as much, as long as the parking lot was small. And so then it would be more used by neighbors walking to the park, walking their dogs, because I guess it's a pretty popular informal dog walking area right now.
Okay.
But yeah, that was the reason for it. Yeah, that might be a question for Dana as far as what the next steps would be and where that would take place. My assumption is that public meetings at the redevelopment commission would be discussing, that's where the discussion would happen. So probably less informal at that point. This is not, all of this is public record because MACOG's a public entity, but this is less formal and maybe more comfortable for people to share their feedback in this way, but no more in-person meetings that MACOG is planning to convene.
But as a part of the redevelopment commission process, it is a public discussion. It is a public meeting. So as they are vetting when they get to the point of making a decision of the final use for the property, there will be an opportunity for public comment at that point.
Put your email address in the chat. I'll add you to the mailing list for this site. And so anytime there's a development with this property moving forward, like another meeting or it's going to the redevelopment commission, I'll be notifying those folks just to make sure, because I'm sure you don't check the redevelopment commission agenda every month. Yes, that is correct. So how that worked is we sent out 7,000 postcards last fall. We sent out 7,000 postcards to residents in multiple neighborhoods surrounding downtown. So like south, east, west, and then north in this area. And asked people to sign up, and it had a picture of this site on it. And we asked people to sign up if they wanted more information about this site moving forward. And then for this meeting, based on our budget, we sent out a smaller subset of postcards to a little over 1,000 people within the 2 postal routes that are surrounding, like where the condos are, and then to the postal route to the north. That's where we focused on those actual mailers, in addition to putting it on social media. But yeah, we recognize not everyone received that notification in the whole city. And so that's why we'll be promoting the written survey moving forward first before we bundle up all the feedback and provide to the city. And we recognize that people that live right next to a site have very different concerns and preferences. Maybe as a whole, the city wants to see the housing shortage addressed, but maybe the neighbors don't. So we were in this in-person meeting, we were trying to capture what are the thoughts of the directly impacted residents who live closest to the site, if that's helpful to understand. The way the postcards work is I don't have names or email addresses. We just say, post office, please mail to everyone in your route. And so it says like, dear postal customer, like when you get advertisements. So I don't know who those people are, have their contact. They would have had to reach out to us, and it had some Spanish, it had, phone, email. But if they didn't reach out and fill out that initial survey, I don't have a way to, I don't think we have in our budget to email or to mail physically something to everyone.
Okay.
But we'll be doing our best to get it out on social media, and maybe even a press release would be warranted just to give people an opportunity to provide feedback from outside just that immediate area. Yeah, I can understand your concern.
Wow.
That's a really good suggestion to make note of, especially in the sense of one of those developments that were put in has a little retail area on the sketch, and maybe that retail area could be a music school where you still could get housing, but that also can be some sort of memorial statement to Conn. So we'll make sure to make note of it.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing your thoughts, and we'll end actually 8 minutes early here. So expect a survey in about the next week, and then we'll be doing our best to get the word out about that so everyone feels like they have an opportunity to provide comments. So with that, thank you for joining us this evening and spending your time learning about this site, and I'll look forward to reading your comments on that survey in the future. So thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.
Have a good night. Bye-bye.